I told my son and daughter-in-law that I'd lost everything, my house, my savings, my dignity, and Jessica looked me dead in the eye and said, "You don't belong here anymore, Robert. We can't afford to support dead weight." But when I was sitting in that hallway crying like a broken old man, Dolores the janitor placed her weathered hand on my shoulder and changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. What happened next wasn't just about one woman's kindness to a stranger. It was about discovering that sometimes the people society makes invisible are the ones who see everything. And sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, when your own family turns their backs on you. If you've ever been abandoned by people you sacrificed everything for, if you've ever discovered that strangers can show more love than your own blood, settle in with your coffee, because this story is about finding family in the most unlikely places and what happens when the people you least expect become your greatest blessing. I'm Robert Washington, 71 years old, and 2 years ago, I was a successful retired accountant with a paid-off house in a good neighborhood, healthy retirement savings, and the kind of financial security I'd worked 45 years to build. I was the father who never said no when Michael needed help, the grandfather who spoiled his kids rotten, the man who took pride in being able to provide for family who'd never had to worry about money because of the foundation I'd built through decades of careful planning. Then everything fell apart at once. Medical bills from a stroke that insurance barely covered, a financial advisor who embezzled most of my retirement portfolio, and investment losses that wiped out what little remained of the nest egg I'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Within 18 months, I went from comfortable security to selling everything I owned, just to cover basic living expenses and mounting debts. Michael and Jessica had benefited from my generosity for over 15 years. I'd paid the down payment on their house, funded Michael's business startup, covered private school tuition for their children, and been their financial safety net whenever life got expensive. They lived in a beautiful home I'd helped them buy, drove cars I'd helped them finance, and enjoyed a lifestyle that my support had made possible. When I finally swallowed my pride and asked for the same kind of help I'd always provided them, the response was colder than a winter morning in Chicago. "Dad, we have our own expenses to worry about," Michael said during that devastating meeting in his office. "We can't take on additional financial burdens right now." Additional financial burdens. Like the father who'd made their comfortable life possible had become some kind of inconvenience, instead of family who deserved the same loyalty and support he'd always shown them. And if you believe that family should be there for each other during difficult times, that loyalty should flow both ways, that the people who helped you succeed should be able to count on you when they're struggling, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm about to tell you about a Filipino janitor named Dolores, who understood family better than my own son, and why you should never underestimate the power of human kindness from people who have every reason to focus on their own problems instead. Because what Dolores did for me wasn't just charity, it was a masterclass in dignity, generosity, and what it means to see someone's worth when the world has decided they don't matter anymore. Let me take you back to when Michael was 7 years old, standing beside me at the kitchen table every Sunday morning while I balanced our household budget with careful precision, teaching him about the importance of saving money, planning for the future, and always having enough set aside to help family members who might need support during difficult times. "Daddy, why do we always save money for other people?" he'd ask, watching me set aside funds for his grandmother's medical expenses or his uncle's car repairs, small acts of generosity that I considered essential to being part of a family that looked out for each other. "Because family takes care of family, son," I'd tell him, letting him help me seal envelopes with money orders and assistance that kept our extended family stable during challenging periods. When you're blessed with resources, you share them with people you love. Someday, if I ever need help, I hope you'll remember how important it is to be there for each other. After my wife Sarah died 8 years ago, Michael and Jessica became even more central to my life. They were my connection to the future, my reason for maintaining the financial stability I'd built through decades of working 12-hour days as one of the few black accountants in a profession that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like me. I'd worked twice as hard as my white colleagues to earn respect and credibility, saved every penny I could, and invested conservatively because I knew that black families in America don't have the same safety nets as white families when financial disasters strike. Everything I'd built was designed to provide security not just for my own retirement, but for Michael's family and any grandchildren who might need support in the future. When Michael started his consulting business 15 years ago, I didn't hesitate to liquidate investments to provide the startup capital he needed. When Jessica decided to stay home with their children instead of working, I helped cover their mortgage payments during the transition. When the kids needed braces, summer camps, college preparation courses, I was always the first person they called, and I was always ready to help because that's what family does for each other. "Dad, we're so grateful for everything you do for us," Jessica would say, when I'd help with yet another expense that their single income couldn't quite cover. "We know how hard you worked to build this security, and we promise we'll pay it forward when we're in a better position to help." Pay it forward. Those words felt genuine at the time, like promises from people who understood the value of the support they were receiving and intended to reciprocate when circumstances allowed. I believed that the generosity I was showing would create a foundation of mutual support that would protect all of us during any future difficulties. The warning signs were subtle at first. Conversations that focused more on what I could provide than how I was doing. Visits that seemed to coincide with financial needs rather than genuine interest in spending time together. Grandchildren who were encouraged to ask me for expensive gifts instead of appreciating simple time spent together. But I was lonely after Sarah's death, grateful for any connection to family and genuinely happy to be able to provide opportunities and security that Michael and Jessica couldn't have afforded on their own. It felt good to be needed, to know that my decades of sacrifice and careful financial planning were making a real difference in the lives of people I loved unconditionally. I should have recognized that relationships built primarily around financial support aren't the same as relationships built around genuine love and mutual respect. I should have noticed that Michael and Jessica's gratitude seemed more about maintaining access to my resources than appreciating the person who was providing them. The first crack in my relationship with Michael and Jessica appeared when I started having health problems that required expensive medical treatment not fully covered by my insurance. The stroke came without warning. One minute I was reading the newspaper at my kitchen table. The next minute, I was waking up in a hospital room with medical bills that would eventually total over $60,000. During my recovery, when I was struggling with speech therapy and physical rehabilitation, the visits from Michael and Jessica became less frequent and more focused on practical concerns than emotional support. "Dad, are you sure you're managing your finances properly during all this medical stuff?" Jessica asked during one of their brief visits. "Maybe we should look at your accounts to make sure everything is being handled correctly." Looking at my accounts. Like my 45 years of professional accounting experience had somehow become irrelevant because I'd had a stroke. Like the careful financial management that had supported their lifestyle for decades couldn't be trusted just because I was dealing with a serious health crisis. "I'm managing everything fine," I assured them, though the medical bills were definitely putting strain on resources I'd planned to preserve for true emergencies. "The important thing is that I'm recovering well, and my cognitive abilities are completely intact. The doctors say I should be back to normal activities within a few months." But normal activities didn't include the same earning capacity I'd had before retirement, and the financial advisor who was supposed to be protecting my portfolio during my recovery was instead stealing it through unauthorized trades and transfers that I didn't discover until it was too late to recover the losses. The embezzlement was sophisticated and devastating. Thomas Mitchell, the advisor I'd trusted with my retirement savings for over 10 years, had been using client funds to cover his gambling debts and maintain a lifestyle his legitimate income couldn't support. By the time federal investigators caught him, he'd stolen nearly $200,000 from my accounts alone, money that was gone forever because he'd already spent it on casino visits and luxury purchases. "Dad, maybe this is a blessing in disguise," Michael said when I explained the financial fraud that had wiped out most of my remaining savings. "Maybe it's time to simplify your life, downsize your expenses, and stop worrying about maintaining the same standard of living you had when you were working. Simplify my life, downsize my expenses." Like losing everything I'd worked for was some kind of lifestyle choice, instead of a devastating financial crime that had destroyed the security I'd spent decades building. The house had to be sold to cover mounting debts and medical expenses that kept growing despite my attempts to manage them conservatively. Everything I'd accumulated, furniture my wife had chosen, artwork we'd collected during 40 years of marriage, the garden she'd loved and I'd maintained as a memorial to her memory, all of it had to be liquidated to pay bills that seemed to multiply faster than my diminished resources could address them. "Where will you live after the house sells?" Jessica asked, but not in the tone of someone who was preparing to offer solutions. More like someone who was making sure they understood the scope of a problem they didn't intend to help solve. "I'm hoping to find a small apartment somewhere affordable," I said, though affordable housing for elderly people on fixed incomes is scarce in most areas. And my credit had been damaged by the financial crisis that forced the house sale in the first place. That's when I realized Michael and Jessica's concern about my finances hadn't been about protecting my interests. It had been about assessing whether I'd still be able to provide financial support for their family, and whether my problems would become their responsibility once my resources were exhausted. The conversation that shattered my remaining illusions about their character happened when I finally asked directly for the kind of help I'd always provided them without hesitation. The meeting that destroyed any remaining hope I had for family support took place in Michael's office on a grey Tuesday morning in November, when I finally swallowed my pride and asked my son for help finding temporary housing while I figured out how to rebuild some kind of financial stability from the wreckage of everything I'd lost. "Michael, I need to ask for something I never thought I'd have to request," I began, sitting in the leather chair across from his expensive desk in the office I'd helped him afford when he was starting his business. "I'm going to need somewhere to stay for a few months while I get back on my feet. The house closes next week, and I haven't been able to find affordable housing that I can manage on Social Security alone." The look that passed between Michael and Jessica should have warned me that I was walking into an ambush, but I was still naive enough to believe that the parent-child bond was stronger than convenience and financial self-interest. "Dad, that's going to be really difficult," Michael said, not meeting my eyes while he shuffled papers on his desk, like my housing crisis was interrupting more important business. "We're using the guest room as Jessica's home office now, and with the kids' schedules and our work commitments, having additional people in the house would create complications we're not prepared to handle." Additional people. Like the father who'd raised him and supported his family for decades, had become a stranger requesting charity instead of family who deserved consideration and care during the most difficult period of his life. "I'm not asking for permanent housing," I explained, trying to keep desperation out of my voice. "Just temporary shelter while I find an apartment I can afford and get some kind of income stability. Maybe a few months at most, and I'd contribute whatever I can toward expenses." That's when Jessica decided to make her position crystal clear. "Robert, we have to think about our own family's needs first," she said, using my first name instead of Dad, like she always had when she wanted something from me. "We can't afford to support additional household members right now, and honestly, we think it would be better for everyone if you found independent solutions instead of depending on us." independent solutions. Like asking family for help during a crisis was some kind of character flaw, instead of the natural expectation of people who've supported each other through decades of relationship and mutual care. Jessica, I've helped support your family for 15 years, I said, my voice getting sharper despite my attempts to stay calm and reasonable. I've never hesitated to provide financial assistance when you needed it. And I've never made you feel like asking for help was a burden or an imposition. I'm asking for temporary housing, not permanent support. That was different, Michael said, finally looking directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost hostile. That was when you had resources to spare, and we were building toward financial independence. Now you're asking us to take on responsibility for your problems when we have our own expenses and obligations to consider. My problems, like the medical crisis, financial fraud, and economic devastation I'd experienced, were personal failures instead of circumstances that could happen to anyone, regardless of how carefully they'd planned or how responsibly they'd managed their resources. But Jessica wasn't finished delivering her verdict on my worth to their family. "You don't belong here anymore, Robert," she said, her voice as cold and final as a judge pronouncing sentence. "We can't afford to support dead weight, and we need to focus on our own family's future instead of trying to solve problems that aren't our responsibility." Dead weight. The man who'd made their comfortable lifestyle possible, who'd been their financial safety net for decades, who'd never hesitated to sacrifice his own comfort for their benefit, had just been dismissed as dead weight by people who'd never missed a meal or worried about housing because of the foundation I'd provided for their security. I sat in that chair for a moment, looking at my son and daughter-in-law, trying to process how people I'd loved and supported unconditionally could look at me during my lowest moment and decide I wasn't worth basic human compassion, let alone family loyalty. Then I got up, walked out of that office, and went to sit in the hallway where I finally let myself cry for everything I'd lost. Not just the money and the house and the security, but the illusion that family meant something more than convenience and financial advantage. I spent the next hour sitting on a bench in the hallway outside Michael's office, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my 71 years of life. The tears came in waves, grief for my wife who wasn't there to help me through this crisis, rage at the financial advisor who'd stolen my security, and most painfully, heartbreak over discovering that the son I'd raised and supported had become someone who could dismiss his father's desperate need as dead weight, not worth their consideration. The building was mostly empty, except for maintenance staff, and I was grateful for the privacy to process the devastation of learning that 15 years of generous support had earned me exactly nothing in terms of family loyalty when I needed it most. Every Christmas gift, every mortgage payment, every business loan, every educational expense I'd covered for their family, none of it had created the foundation of mutual care I'd thought we were building together. That's when Dolores Reyes appeared at the end of the hallway, pushing her cleaning cart with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been maintaining that office building for decades. She was a small Filipino woman, probably close to my age, wearing the kind of practical uniform that makes service workers invisible to most people who consider themselves too important to notice the people who keep their environments clean and functional. She stopped when she saw me crying, her expression shifting from professional focus to genuine human concern, in a way that reminded me what kindness looked like after an hour of experiencing its complete absence. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but spoke it with more grace and compassion than most native speakers manage. "I'm fine," I lied, wiping my eyes and trying to compose myself because I didn't want to burden a stranger with problems she couldn't solve and shouldn't have to hear about just because she'd been unfortunate enough to encounter me during my breakdown. But Dolores had been cleaning office buildings long enough to recognize the difference between temporary frustration and deep, life-changing grief. She parked her cart and sat down on the bench beside me, not because she had time to spare in her busy schedule, but because she'd seen someone in pain and decided that human connection was more important than efficiency. "I work here 20 years, she said, settling beside me with the comfortable ease of someone who'd learned to find moments of rest wherever they were available. "I see many people come and go, happy days and sad days. Today is sad day for you. Today is the day I learned that family doesn't mean what I thought it meant," I said, more to myself than to her, but she was listening with the kind of attention that invited honesty instead of polite deflection. "Family is not always blood," Dolores said simply, placing her weathered hand on my shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was more genuine than anything I'd experienced from Michael and Jessica during months of financial crisis. "Sometimes family is people who choose to care about you because of who you are, not because of what you can do for them." That simple touch, a stranger's hand on my shoulder offering comfort I couldn't find from my own son, broke something open in my chest that had been building pressure for months. Not just the immediate rejection I'd experienced that morning, but the gradual realization that the people I'd loved most had never actually seen me as more than a resource to be managed and eventually discarded when I was no longer useful. "I'm sorry for crying in front of you," I said, embarrassed that my problems had spilled over into her workday. "You probably have more important things to do than listen to an old man's troubles." "Nothing more important than seeing someone who needs kindness," she replied, and her certainty about that priority taught me more about human dignity in 30 seconds than 15 years of family relationships had managed to demonstrate. What happened next changed not just my immediate circumstances, but my entire understanding of what generosity looks like when it comes from someone who has genuine reasons to focus on their own struggles instead of helping strangers with problems they didn't create. "You want to tell me what happened?" Dolores asked, not with the nosiness of someone seeking gossip, but with the genuine concern of someone who'd recognized pain and decided to offer whatever comfort was within her power to provide. I found myself explaining everything: the medical crisis, the financial fraud, the loss of my house, and finally, the devastating rejection from Michael and Jessica that morning. Dolores listened without judgment, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions that showed she was really hearing what I was telling her instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. "Your son and his wife, they work in this building?" she asked when I finished my story. "Michael has an office on the 3rd floor. He's had it for about 10 years now." Dolores was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing information in a way that suggested she knew more about Michael and Jessica than she was initially letting on. "I clean their office every Tuesday and Friday," she said finally. "I hear them talking sometimes when they think no one is listening. Rich people, they forget that cleaning ladies have ears and understand English better than they think we do." And so what she told me next revealed that Michael and Jessica's financial situation was very different from what they'd been telling me. They weren't struggling with tight budgets or genuine inability to help. They were spending money on luxury vacations, expensive restaurants, and lifestyle upgrades that they'd been hiding from me while claiming they couldn't afford to offer assistance during my crisis. "Last month I heard them talking about buying a boat," Dolores said, shaking her head with the kind of disgust that comes from watching people waste resources while refusing to help family members in need. $30,000 for something they use maybe 10 times a year, but they tell you they can't afford to help their father, who gave them everything. A boat. While I was selling my furniture to pay medical bills and looking for homeless shelters because I couldn't afford rent, they were discussing recreational purchases that cost more than most people make in a year. But Dolores wasn't finished sharing what she'd observed during her years of maintaining their office space. "They talk about you sometimes," she continued, her voice getting harder as she remembered conversations that had clearly disturbed her. "Your daughter-in-law." She says mean things about how you should have planned better for retirement, how your problems are not their fault, how they don't owe you anything just because you helped them before. Don't owe me anything. After 15 years of financial support that had made their comfortable lifestyle possible, Jessica apparently believed that assistance creates no obligations, no foundation of mutual care, no expectation that generosity might be reciprocated when circumstances change. "But here's what I want to tell you," Dolores said, standing up from the bench and looking at me with an intensity that made me pay closer attention to whatever she was about to say. "I have seen real poverty, real struggle, real families who have nothing but still take care of each other. Your son and his wife, they have everything, but they have no idea what family means." Then she did something that restored my faith in human decency and showed me what actual generosity looks like when it comes from someone who understands the value of kindness because they've experienced its absence. "You come home with me tonight," she said, as matter-of-factly as if she were offering me a cup of coffee instead of shelter when my own family had refused to provide it. "I have small apartment, but I have couch, and I have food, and I have respect for elders who deserve better than what their children are giving them." That night, I discovered what real family looks like when it's built on genuine care instead of financial obligation. Dolores shared her modest dinner with me, gave me clean blankets for her couch, and treated me with more dignity and respect than I'd received from Michael and Jessica during months of crisis. Her apartment was small and simple, furnished with second-hand pieces and decorated with family photos that showed a life rich in relationships, even when resources were limited. She introduced me to her adult children who visited that evening, explaining my situation without embarrassment or judgment, and they welcomed me like I was a relative who belonged there instead of a charity case who needed temporary assistance. "Mama always brings home strays," her daughter Maria laughed, but it wasn't mockery. It was appreciation for a mother who'd raised them to understand that helping others isn't a burden, but a privilege that comes with having enough resources to share. Over the following weeks, Dolores helped me navigate social services, find affordable housing assistance, and connect with support networks for elderly people facing financial hardship. She never made me feel like I was taking advantage of her generosity, never suggested that my presence was inconvenient, never treated my problems like they were more than she could handle or more than I deserved to receive. The apartment I eventually found was subsidized housing for seniors, small but clean and affordable on my Social Security income. Dolores helped me move my few remaining possessions, brought me groceries for my first week, and made sure I understood that our friendship would continue regardless of whether I needed her practical assistance. 6 months later, I received a call from Michael asking if I'd be interested in rebuilding our relationship now that he and Jessica were having marriage problems and could use some family support. Apparently, when your marriage is falling apart and your business is struggling, having an experienced accountant for a father starts looking valuable again. I told him I'd already found my family, thank you very much, and it consisted of people who cared about me when I had nothing to offer them except my company and appreciation for their kindness. Today, I volunteer at the same senior services office where Dolores connected me with resources, helping other elderly people navigate financial crises and family abandonment. We have Sunday dinners at Dolores's apartment, where her children and grandchildren have adopted me as an honorary family member who belongs at their table because of who I am, not what I can provide. Dolores Reyes, a janitor who most people never notice and many people treat as invisible, taught me more about dignity, generosity, and family loyalty than my own son ever did. She had every reason to focus on her own struggles and ignore a crying old man in an office hallway, but she chose compassion instead of convenience, and that choice changed both our lives. Tell me in the comments, Have you ever found that strangers treated you with more kindness than your own family during difficult times? Have you discovered that sometimes the people who have the least are the most willing to share what they have? If this story reminded you that real family is about choosing to care for each other, not just sharing DNA, that dignity comes from how we treat others rather than what we own, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I'm Robert Washington, and I've got more stories about finding unexpected allies, about learning the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them, and about discovering that sometimes the most important blessings come from the most unlikely sources.